Marhaba. Hello. I'm Dick Durbin. Let me start by thanking Jim Zogby for two reasons. First, I want to thank Jim and Eileen for raising a brilliant and wonderful son by the name of Joe Zogby. He's my lawyer in Senate, my staff director, my right hand on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he's an extraordinary person. And I want to thank Jim for his courageous leadership as president of the Arab American Institute. In a time of increasingly tough rhetoric, Jim Zogby continues to be an eloquent voice of reason. I want to thank all of you for using the occasion of your National Leadership Conference to focus on the global refugee crisis. The world today is experiencing the worst refugee crisis since the end of World War II. Nearly 60 million people have been displaced, including more than half of Syria's 23 million people. They've been forced from their homes since the fighting began. More than 4 million Syrian men, women, and children are registered as refugees. 2 weeks ago, I traveled to Greece, to Athens, and to the island of Lesbos. It's the new ground zero in the global refugee crisis. I went to that island to talk with refugees who are risking everything to escape war and terror in the hopes to make a better life for their families. They call it the La Grande Marche, or the Great Walk. Hundreds of thousands literally leaving Turkey and walking into Europe looking for a safer and better life. Now, most of the Syrians that I met were middle-class families who were exhausted and broken from years of horrific war. Their stories were heartbreaking. They talked about fleeing with their kids, being victimized by smugglers, and the conditions they faced. Last spring, when the first refugees started arriving on Lesbos, it was one boat a week. Soon, it was a boat a day. Now, 2,000 men, women, and children are arriving on that tiny island every single day. The toll on Syria's children is staggering. The world was moved to grief by that photo of that tiny little lifeless body of that toddler in the red shirt washed up on the beach in Turkey. Alan Kurdi was one of the more than 10,000 Syrian children who've been killed in this war. Thousands of children become separated from their families, and they're trying to reach Europe on their own. And millions of Syrian children are out of school, missing an education and a future. The refugee crisis is straining Syria's neighbors, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, to the breaking point. And while Syria is the epicenter of the crisis, it's not alone. Millions of people from Iraq, Afghanistan, and North Africa are also fleeing war and instability. My trip to that Greek island reaffirmed my strong belief that the United States must do more. Our nation is the largest donor of humanitarian assistance to Syrian refugees, but we can, we should, and we must do more. It's in our national interest, of course, but more than that, I believe it's our moral obligation as a nation to help bring some stability to these families in this region. This is the humanitarian crisis of our time. 3 years ago, I successfully pushed the administration to grant temporary protected status to Syrians then living in the U.S. Last year, I chaired a Senate hearing on refugees. The administrator issued exemptions, making it easier for Syrian refugees to come to the U.S. In May, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota and I asked the administration to admit at least 65,000 refugees by the end of 2016. I think that number should even be larger. Refugee Council USA, a nonpartisan coalition of leading U.S. refugee agencies, has called for the U.S. to accept 200,000 refugees by the end of 2016, half from Syria. I agree. I'm also proud to be a co-sponsor of a bipartisan emergency supplemental bill providing $1 billion in emergency funding to address this refugee crisis. We have an obligation, I believe, to help those who remain in Syria and in great peril from extremist groups in their own government. The Assad government continues to target civilians for slaughter with their barrel bombs and chlorine gas. The Syrian military attacks hospitals and rescue forces simply because they're working to save innocent lives. In April, I joined a bipartisan group and I asked the president to work with world leaders to create safe zones in Syria for displaced people. I realize that creating them carries risk, but the moral costs of inaction are too high. As the safe zones grow, it's my hope it will move us toward dialogue and ultimately toward peace in Syria. And as urgent and as heartbreaking as the Syrian refugee crisis is, we know there will be more and worse human crises in the future, unless we get serious fast about issues like global climate change. Remember how the crisis in Syria began? When the pro-democracy protests started in 2011, many of the protesters were displaced farmers. They'd suffered 4 years of drought. That drought made worse by climate change. Climate change isn't a matter of debate. It's a matter of life and death. We need to do something about it. I believe most Americans will welcome Syrian refugees with open arms. In fact, I've received letters from Illinois residents and from our clergy, from the temples and the churches and the synagogues who want to help. Your leadership is helping to educate and mobilize the American people to respond to this crisis. I look forward to hearing your ideas and working with you to help the Syrians driven from their homes and those in peril inside Syria. It's our American tradition and our moral obligation.